Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. So, we are going to be talking about the evolutionary path of the human being, of us, and our planet in the cosmos. And I've called this talk The Mysteries of Materialization because we're going to focus in at the end a little bit more on the materialization arc of humanity, which is really our deep, 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 deep past. And we're going to dive into that and get a little bit more of a sense of the time before the fall and human consciousness and sort of the spiritual beliefs around that time and what that really looked like, because it's very difficult to actually understand where we are, which is really the beginning of a spiritualization arc, or sometimes in the New Age, it's called ascension. But it's really the beginning of the spiritualization arc of humanity and of the planet. And it's kind of challenging to understand exactly what that is without understanding where we've been and what the materialization arc is. So, what is the materialization arc, or what is the materialization phase of humanity, also known as the fall, or the fall into matter, or taking form? What does that look like? And what epochs were that? What was that phase? So we're going to get into that. And we're also going to get into the midpoint, the transition point between the materialization arc of humanity and the spiritualization arc of humanity, which is the point of Christ, or the solar point, or the point of Christ's incarnation, or the mystery of Golgotha, using the anthroposophical system. And actually, I want to point out that today, and for most of my work in the last few years, I really like to use the anthroposophical system and the anthroposophical cosmology, or the Steiner work. That is what I prefer to use. So that is what I'll be using today. And I will link some resources underneath if you want to go even deeper using that system. Okay. Also, I wanted to add, because of Mars Mysteries isn't airing tonight, I decided that I really wanted to stagger in some esoteric lectures, because a lot of the material of Mars Mysteries, to really understand the dark occult, or the deep occult roots in society, you have to have an esoteric understanding. We really can't dive into certain issues and certain topics covered unless we understand our history, how we evolve, and the esoteric laws and esoteric realities. So I'm going to be staggering Mars. I'm going to be staggering Mars Mysteries throughout the rest of the year and into the next year, between lectures and my usual content. So there will be more Mars Mysteries coming, don't worry. Okay, so as I mentioned in this introduction, there are really two distinct phases of humanity, or human development, and also planetary development. And it looks like a bell curve. Okay, it looks like a bell curve like this, like a U. And what that is there is the first arc, which is the materialization arc, which is also known as the fall, or falling into matter, or the materialization of form, the kind of slow materialization of form, falling from a more spiritual, astral form, in essence, into a completely material body. And what that process was, that's all in really the materialization arc of humanity, and really the first or prior developmental arc of humanity. And everything actually develops in this way in our solar system. It's how we evolve. It's cyclical like that. It's kind of taking on density and then releasing ourselves from it. And this back and forth process, this oscillation, this contraction and expansion, is what leads to the refinement of the soul and of the individual. Okay, so the first arc is the materialization arc, and it is taking on matter or transforming oneself from a spiritual condition, so like an astral form or more etheric form, into a physical form or into the material plane. Okay, and why this is also a very interesting conversation is that when you start getting into this long history of humanity and the reality that we have materialized here, um, you start realizing that humanity and the earth aren't really solid. They're not really matter. They rest in matter for a period of time, a consolidation period, if you will, and then they rise out of it. And so the planet really isn't solid. Okay, and neither is the human being. All right, and this is why esoteric education is so important, because what does it mean to not be solid? What does it mean to not be matter? And what are the laws that govern that? Because the laws in the material plane don't necessarily apply exactly to the laws of the spiritual plane. Okay, and once we reached a certain point of, I guess you could say, peak materialization, we had a very, very significant event on the planet. And that was the incarnation of Christ. And that was to shift humanity into a different segment or into a different kind of evolutionary phase. So you have the materialization phase, and then you have the incarnation of Christ, which effectively shifts the energy, flips it inward, and then we rise. So the incarnation of Christ is actually an extremely important event, because it is his incarnation and that sacrificial rite that he did in the mystery of Golgotha that allows humanity to rise out of matter again. Okay? After that center point, after that incarnation of Christ, after the solar spirit is taken on by a human being, what ends up happening is that we begin our spiritualization phase. So the spiritualization phase is releasing ourselves from matter, or to transform ourselves out of matter, to spiritualize ourselves out of matter, and loosen ourselves from our physical form into a more etheric form, and then into a more astral form. And this is what is known as the ascension, or, you know, in Christ's ritual of Golgotha, him rising from the dead, right? Him resurrecting represents the spiritualization of all humanity now being available. Okay, so let's get even more into this. Let's go back to the first phase, the materialization arc of humanity. So this is often known as the fall, and it's also often associated with the feminine. You have a lot of imagery that I like to reference a lot on my channel of Persephone falling into the underworld, or she gets taken by Hades into the underworld. This is Persephone falling. You have the descent of Venus into the material plane. You have the fall of Inanna into the material plane. You have Alice in Wonderland falling down the rabbit hole. And so the materialization arc is associated with the feminine impulse. Our deep past was also a matriarchy. It's where a lot of deep feminine mysteries reside. And it's basically, and also Eve, don't forget about Eve, who was associated with the fall as well. And so the fall is really the story of humanity's materialization into form. That's really what we're looking at when it comes to esoteric science. The fall is humanity's materialization into form. And this took an exceptionally long period of time. If you want to look at the cosmos, in the anthroposophical system, the fall overall into matter of the planet, so our planetary sphere, the Earth, the spirit of it materializing, And the human being begins and is associated with various different planetary spheres. So the first sphere is Saturn, which is basically almost like non-existent heat. And then it manifests into sun phase and moon phase. And then finally we reach our deepest point of materialization, which is the earth. And so I have a lecture on this that I will post below if you want to get into the cosmic side of things. I'm not going to get into that today because I've already covered it. But we were materialized. The planet was materialized through a very, very long period of time, beginning when it first sort of entered any visible dimension to us through the Saturn portal or the Saturn arc, and then moving downward into its most material expression, which is the earth, which is matter, full matter, which is where we have been on the planet. And so we also fall in what is sometimes called recapitulations. So we're sort of falling or spiraling deeper into matter through repeating cycles as well. And that's very important to understand, because when you get into the more recent epochs of time, like Lemuria and Atlantis, you can begin to look and you can see that, moving from the Lemurian epoch to the Atlantean epoch, there is a distinct change in form, and a densifying of the form, and a specific change in consciousness. And then going into the post-Atlantean epoch from Atlantis, and we are in the post-Atlantean epoch today, by the way, you see another distinct change in form, and you see another distinct change in consciousness. So we go through these cycles that are repetitions, that are recapitulations of prior patterns, and we spiral into matter, and then we kind of begin to spiral out of them through the process of recapitulations, the same sort of karmic issues. We roll through them again, planetary karmic issues. Okay, and all the while in the materialization arc of development, we are creating our form. Okay, we are creating our form. Now, this is something that is almost hard for us to understand and difficult for us to grasp, because we are no longer in a phase where we are creating our form. Okay, as I mentioned before, we reached the peak, the midpoint, which is associated with the incarnation of Christ, and we are now fully materialized. We now have our physical form has reached its completion in the sense of this plane of matter, right? That's why in the Hindu traditions they talk about getting off of the wheel of samsara, getting off the wheel of incarnation, getting out of the material plane, not having to be trapped in the material plane. Well, in order to not be trapped in the material plane, you have to have a form, and your consciousness has to be developed enough to to spiritualize your material form out of this realm. You have to get to that point where not only do you have a physical materialized form that has all of the organs, all of the right energy channels, it has to be, your form has to be a perfect reflection of essentially God, of cosmos. Okay, and this is actually very, very important. So our physical form is a direct representation of the sun, of the cosmos, and of God. Okay, we are the physical expression of that. That's what our body is. That's why people say the body is a temple, because it has taken, there is no time at that point. Like, the amount of time it's taken us and lives that it has taken us to achieve this level of physical perfection is almost it's unfathomable to us in this phase. Like, it's to our minds, it's unfathomable. Okay, and what we have also with humanity descending into matter, is we have essentially, humanity is the 10th hierarchy in the spiritual hierarchies, or humanity is the 10th hierarchy of angels. So the human form is actually an angelic form. And the human form, the human body, the human system on Earth is directly connected to the angelic planes in its creation. It has been developing alongside all of the angelic kingdoms, with the angels, with all of these high spiritual deities in a system of spiritual initiation and cosmic initiation. So the human being, your form at this point in time, this very important point of time, is an angelic form. And we are the 10th hierarchy of angels. The human form is the 10th hierarchy in the angelic hierarchy, the 10th tier. It is the 10th tier in the spiritual hierarchies. We are physical angels. And our specific task as we materialize is to develop our I, or to develop our individuality. Okay? So this is extremely important to know, because there's some theories that are beginning to form in modern spirituality that do not acknowledge that the human form is an angelic form, as it is and has been formed over a long period of time perfectly. It doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter where you're from, how tall you are, what you look like. This form that we have here is part of the angelic kingdom. Okay, this is where you start getting into, and we'll cover later in this lecture, the modification of form, and why we don't want to modify the form, and why, quite frankly, it's weird and bizarre to go in and modify our form and think that we evolve through physical modifications and stuff like that. It's completely wacky, backwards ideology that we'll get into in the last part of this lecture. But I just really want to hammer home that, the planet and humanity is the caretaker of Gaia, of the earth. And it is the physical expression of it. It's the physical expression of the sun, of the earth. Everything is interwoven. And it has taken a very long time for us to materialize this perfect human form. Whether you feel like your form works very well, whether you like it or whatever it is, the imprint that you have within you, the ability to take this form, is a very big deal. It is a very big deal, and we must not downplay it at this time. So there was a distinctly different sort of culture when we were in this phase of materialization, when we were falling into matter. It wasn't like where we are now, because we are now at a point of spiritualization. We're actually spiritualizing out of matter. We've just begun the process of actually spiritualizing our form. So we're in a completely different arc of development, and it's almost hard to think about what it would be like to be in the opposite arc, our materialization arc. But it is actually in our deep, deep, deep memory. And the more we talk about it, the more we can begin to awaken those memories, those cellular memories, and understand. And so what would it look like when we were in this materialization arc? Like, what would the religious systems look like? What would our worship look like? And when we were in the materialization arc, how it kind of looked is that we were sort of in a interesting position where our spiritual body was sort of hovering above our physical body, and we could sort of look down at the physical form, and we could see it developing, and we could see it. Now, the closer we got to material form, the more we came into our physicality, the more knitted into the physical we were. But at the very beginning of the materialization phase, we were very fully aware of the physical form that was developing below us or beneath us in a different density. It was very obvious that we were a spiritual essence that was taking on and that a form was forming around us and kind of beneath us slightly, that a form was forming around us. And so we were very aware that we were spiritual beings because that was where the majority of our consciousness was. The majority of our consciousness was in the spiritual plane, and we were kind of seeing this physicality form around us, but we were still separate from it. And the whole goal of that period of time, and in our mind, and the closest that we could probably access or understand, is the Lemurian epoch and then the Atlantean epoch. So in those epochs, we were still very much taking on form. And oftentimes we associate the biblical fall actually with the fall of Atlantis sometimes. But ultimately, we are seeing a form sort of form around us. And in our mind, we are aware, at least to some degree, that we are part of the angelic hierarchy in the cosmos. You know, we're part of the spiritual hierarchy. You know, in a sense, we're almost, in a little bit, we're made of angelic consciousness. And so we're very, at this point in time, we're extremely aware that whatever form we are creating around us, whatever form that is being created, the human form, it has to mirror the cosmos. It has to exactly mirror the earth. It has to be an expression of the earth, and it has to be an expression of the sun. And it has to be directly linked to the hierarchy of angelic consciousness above us, or the spiritual hierarchies. So spiritual hierarchies are a chain of forms, cosmic forms that are that get less material as you go up, but they're different. They're technically human forms, but they're less materialized. And so the 10th hierarchy of angels, which is human beings, we are the most materialized angelic form, but we have not yet mastered this form. We have not yet mastered the earth and mastered our developmental task yet. So we are part of this hierarchy of angels, but we have not mastered it. So we are not angels. We are sort of working upon ourselves in order to get to that level of mastery, in which we will eventually reach the sort of final stage of our spiritualization, which is called Atman, this complete spiritualization of form, and is associated with the planetary sphere of Vulcan. That is when we will reach sort of this entrance into a higher point of mastership. That's when we will have completely traced the bell curve to the releasing ourselves from matter. And that is in a very, very long time. So as we were forming our form, you know, we're looking down at it, we're feeling ourselves knitting into matter. We are very aware that the form that we are, and the form is sort of forming like condensation. And it's forming according to our thoughts. So we're sort of manifesting it. And it's not like we can create whatever we want. We are within a certain cosmic shape, right? We are manifesting semi-consciously a form, but that form is still very much governed by universal laws and higher beings as well. Now, these higher beings, these higher angelic forms, they're not creating us, okay? We are essentially working upon ourselves. And there are higher forms that are helping us in this process, but they're not gods, they're not aliens, and they are more like just arms of the Godhead itself carrying out certain tasks. Okay, it's very important to make that distinction. So the goal is that we want to, over time, create this human form, and it has to have all the proper organs, all the proper channels, and it has to be a perfect human form. And the problem is that if we don't manifest our form correctly, then the form won't survive. So the whole thing about the materialization arc of humanity, and why it is such a big deal that you're even here, that you're watching this in a human form, it means that you have achieved this. It's a very, very big deal. Because when we were, creating our form, sometimes animal parts would manifest on the form. There would be a tail, or there would be a pig nose, or there would be certain animal or weird parts that would overshadow the form that we were creating for a period of time. Even sometimes there would be plant things going on. It was much more rare, though. And so there were sort of images that were being pulled from the various different kingdoms of life that were not the human kingdom. And that was because the thoughts that we were thinking and the way that we were functioning at that time was not completely in line with love. And it was not completely in line with God. We weren't understanding something. And so whenever we would go in this direction, a kind of animal part would manifest, or a certain chimerical image would manifest in our form. Okay. And so that was not good. We did not want to be pulling from the plant kingdom or pulling from the animal kingdom. We wanted to create the human form, which has all of those kingdoms within it, but is a perfect representation of all of it together, which is what we have here. So again, if the form was not created properly and in complete alignment with God, with nature, with the angelic hierarchies above us, with the sun and with the earth, the form would not survive. What do I mean by that? It means that the soul and the astral and etheric essence may begin to enter the form, but over time, as the recapitulations begin to spiral through time, that form will not have what it takes to survive all of those recapitulations. And it will eventually break down, and it will eventually die. And so one of the biggest issues during the materialization phase of humanity was to create a form, was to create the human form and all of the beautiful systems that we have in it. And so that was a very big deal. And this happened in the Lemurian phase, when we were more of an etheric form, and sometimes the Theosophists have described it as like a jelly. We were sort of more like a jelly in the Lemurian epoch. And we actually didn't have, especially in the beginning of the Lemurian epoch, we didn't really have genders. We were just sort of fully taking on a physical shape and a physical form. And we were still reproducing through what is often called sweat-born in the Theosophical system. It's called the sweat-born. And what that meant is it was basically female, then you had a daughter cell, right? And it was just basically like natural mitosis was happening. There wasn't really any differentiation, but the form was being created. And then you get another recapitulation that goes by, and another one, and you fall deeper into matter. There's more individuation. There's more detail being created. And then by the end of the Lemurian epoch, you start to get the beginnings of the male and female form. But it looks very prepubescent. Very small genitals are forming. It looks like an adolescent child. And that is at the end of the Lemurian epoch, going into the Atlantean epoch. And of course, this is thousands and thousands and thousands of years. We go into the Atlantean epoch, and that's where we finally get into what the adult-looking humans that we are now. And you get the splitting of genders in the Casey work. There's a lot of detail about the splitting of the genders, and also the higher spiritual initiates that were helping humanity through this process, the spiritual masters that were helping humanity through this process, helping humanity in that Atlantean epoch really round out the form. The Atlantean epoch is significant because it was the last epoch where we had that intense materialization energy. The genders finally split. There was male and female, and we reached our sort of perfect peak there. There was a lot of help that we had through very high spiritual initiates and masters that were guiding us in how to create how to really round out our form, and do that through loving thoughts, acting in alignment with God, not against it. There's a whole tradition that's actually very similar to the tradition we have now, but it was just anchored towards the materialization of our form a little bit more. So that is the materialization phase. And actually the Casey readings are very interesting because they go into detail about a lot of black magic practices that had taken place that were actually about creating chimeras and about creating cyborgs. And this one very dark group in Atlantis that was called the Sons of Belial that were really not getting the task. They really were sick. And they were doing a lot of things during this time, trying to materialize strange forms for reasons I will get into in a different lecture that I cannot cover today. And there was this group of initiates and masters and high adepts in Atlantis that are associated with the Emilius group in the Casey work. And they were actually trying to make sure that the human form was perfected, and that the human form was part of the 10th hierarchy of angels. It was directly connected into the Angelic Hierarchy, and that it would survive the future planetary development, right? And we need to have a form that is capable of fully merging and taking on the sun. That is a huge, huge, huge thing. It has to represent the earth and the sun. And if, as we reach that spiritualization phase, our form isn't properly developed to hold that, to contain that, it doesn't have the proper circuitry, it doesn't have the right organs, including spiritual organs, then the form dies under the intense process of spiritualization and radiation from the sun, a spiritual kind of radiation from the sun that helps in the spiritualization of man. The form may not survive that process unless it is perfect at this point of development. And so we have a lot of phenomenal spiritual masters and great adepts, some that are reincarnated now, that were part of that. And they had the ability to see down the line of the future what the form had to be and how much it had to be a direct physicalization of the angelic hierarchies. If it was not, again, it would not survive into the future. It would not survive the intense compression into matter and then the spiritualization process. It would just die. And then everything would be for naught, because there would be no human form to spiritualize into the earth and into the cosmos again. So this is how important this materialization arc is, how important the masters were in that, and also just beginning to touch on how there are black magic rites, and there are individuals on this planet that are still really stuck in this prior phase of materialization. They do not acknowledge Christ, the work that Christ did as an initiate, as a master, and therefore they don't understand the spiritualization arc. We're not going to understand the spiritualization arc of humanity unless you understand Christ. So if we don't understand that right, if we don't understand what that was, what happened, we're not going to understand the spiritualization arc. We're not going to be able to flip our consciousness in the way that it needs to in order to spiritualize. And so there are various different dark magic groups on the planet who are stuck in this materialization arc. They're obsessed with creating forms. It's an illness. The mind is stuck in the past. The individual's consciousness is stuck in a prior rhythm of the past and applying it to a time that is no longer relevant. That's what all black magic is. So there is still individuals that are very much trapped in a prior phase of development, and they do not understand the song has changed, the music has changed, the rhythm has changed. It's different now. And they're still trying to apply this materialization magic, this materialization religion during a spiritualization phase. It doesn't work. And what ends up happening is you end up getting certain groups that are only going to sink deeper and deeper into the mineral realm, into a lower kingdom of life that is inhuman, because the form has not been carried properly. They have not been working upon the form in this first spiritualization arc that we are in order for it to survive. And so this is where you get that other arc of evolution. It looks like this. It looks like intense materialization, and then you get to the point of the midpoint that's associated with the cross and with Christ, and then this cannot be accepted, and then so you get just a straight downward arc. You get just complete and utter materialization, obsession with materialization. And there is no flip into the spiritualization arc through Christ consciousness, through understanding what that Christ impulse in the cosmos is. And that's where you get the two paths. And that's also in the Steiner teachings, that's where you get Ahriman. Okay, that's where you get that harmonic impulse of materialization and hypermaterialization, and no Christ impulse to balance it and pull it upward. All right. So now that we're talking about the incarnation of Christ and the Christ impulse in the cosmos, let's get into that midpoint. So you have the materialization arc that's like this. It's like a falling downward U. Okay. And then once you get to the midpoint, you have to have something that takes that materialization point and flips it into a spiritualization process. The cosmos can't do that. The cosmos can't make you as a physicalized individual form now enter into the spiritualization phase. You now have sovereignty. You're now an individual. The only way that you can enter into that spiritualization arc is if a human being does it first. And this human being has to take on the spirit of the sun. And because we are all the sun, we are all part of the sun, just as we are part of the earth. When somebody takes on the essence of the sun, or in Anthroposophy, we call that the sun spirit, then what ends up happening is that everyone has access to that force. So a very, very, very high initiate or spiritual master has to be prepared, and then they have to take on the sun spirit, and they have to do specific rites that allows that sun spirit to be available for mankind. But it comes through an individual. An individual must take on the sun at that point. And at this point in time, the sun is also slowly descending. It's being pulled downwards through that materialization energy. So as you have the earth moving and materializing, the spirit of the sun is also getting pulled closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to the earth until an individual can take it on. And Christ takes it on at the age of 30. He takes on the spirit of the sun at the age of 30. And then he dies in an apotropaic ritual at the age of 33, which is a very specific ritual which is the mystery of Golgotha in Anthroposophy, but it's also called the crucifixion in esoteric Christianity and dogmatic Christianity. And then what that does is it's a very specific rite, and it allows humanity to now, within themselves, have access to the solar force, the Christ force, the catalyzing force that allows us to spiritualize ourselves out of matter. And that happened when his blood, which was a solar force containing everything within it, the beginning and the end of everything, that contained the pure Christ impulse, goes into the earth and fertilize the earth in a way and change the spirit of the earth. So then we now have the ability to function in a completely different way that we did not have before the incarnation of Christ. We did not have certain capacities until that moment. And a human being does have to do that because we had just gotten our human form. So again, the cosmos can't just doodly-doodly-do make you, it can't make you go into a spiritualization arc. There has to be an individual that is physicalized, take on the force of the sun. And then they have to do a specific rite that gives it to mankind. But once it enters one individual, in a sense, it already has entered everyone. And then there's various different rites that have to be done in order to get it in the right, get it through the right channels and whatnot for the earth. So that is the importance of Christ and Jesus Christ in the incarnation of the earth, in our existence. Now, there are masters before Christ that were also in the Christ impulse, part of the Christ impulse. And there will be masters that are still in the Christ impulse and the Grail impulse after Jesus as well. But this was a very specific kind of incarnation, and it was a very specific kind of rite that allowed humanity to take everything that was initially to them an outward experience. You know, we're manifesting our physical form, and so we can only know ourselves by the external world. You know, in the materialization arc, we had no internal knowledge. Like, we had no individuality because we didn't even have a form in which to be an individual. We were mostly in an astral form and interconnected with one another, you know, in a kind of spiritual interconnectivity. Sometimes Steiner will call this the natural clairvoyance. So we didn't really have the ability to do a calculation ourselves, like mathematical, or we couldn't do like a logical understanding of something. We just knew, right? We just knew everything. And so eventually, if we want to truly be an integrated human being and a sovereign member of the cosmos, we want to be a sovereign individual, a sovereign member of the Angelic Hierarchy, a 10th Angelic Hierarchy, we've got to be able to be an individual. We've got to be able to be sovereign. And all of the functions of the cosmos have to be going on inside of us. We have to see that and we have to know that. And then we have to begin to understand these processes as an inner thing. So again, before, even in Atlantis and Lemuria, you know, it was different than what it is now. And we would learn about ourselves and the world by what was manifesting around us. Even like the heavy extreme use of technologies, that was really an Atlantean thing, because we really didn't know ourselves or what was going on unless we could kind of project it on a crystal or project it into some kind of external form, and then we would learn something. We're not there anymore. All of these technologies are happening inside of us. All these processes that were once observed externally are now inside of us. There's internal processes that are exact functions of the cosmos and universal law that we have to understand how it works in a human being. How is the human being, the individual, an exact representative of the angelic hierarchies, of the sun, of the cosmos? We have to know that as an individual from within. And so what Christ does is he brings the knowledge of the cosmos and the knowledge of the angelic hierarchies. He brings all of that inward. And that's where we get that very famous quote, the kingdom of heaven is within. Well, it wasn't within before. There was no within. Because again, our soul and our consciousness was not so deeply knitted into matter, into our form. Okay? So it's that taking all of that, everything that was part of the materialization phase, and now bringing it inward as an integrated part of who we are, that we are now in command of, that we can now be creative through. And then once that happens, that's why it leads to the spiritualization arc, is because once it's inside of us, we can begin to work upon ourselves creatively, and completely work upon our I and our form to spiritualize ourselves out of matter. If the forces of heaven are not within us, then we cannot spiritualize our form out of matter. We have to spiritualize ourselves with our free will, with our thoughts, with our actions, out of the material plane. And we have to do it via our own volition, through our own passion, through our own awareness. And we can also choose not to as well. Okay? So that is the importance of Christ. Christ actually allows us to spiritualize our form out of matter. That's why Christ is associated with resurrection and immortality. And that's why he arises from the tomb, right? The tomb is also physicality. The tomb is also our body. So when Christ rises out of the tomb, right, when he emerges, this is also symbolic of humanity now being able to rise out of our tomb, which is the material plane, which is the physical body. We are entombed in matter. We are entombed in matter in our physical form. But now, since the impulse of the Son, the impulse of Christ has been introduced to us, the mystery of Golgotha, we now have the ability to work upon ourselves and rise out of our body and spiritualize our form. We can do an alchemical process now that allows us to actually turn our physical body, our form, into an etheric form via our own mind, via our own volition. Now, this takes a long period of time, but we are in that process now. Okay. So what does the spiritualization arc look like? I'll just touch on this because I'll probably have to go a little bit deeper into this in other lectures, but the spiritualization arc is something that the human being is going through and also the planet is going through. So when we were talking about the crucifixion there and we were talking about the mystery of Golgotha, we're not just talking about the human being now having this catalyst force within ourselves and this new perspective within ourselves. The energy was shifted and flipped inward, right? So that also happened to the planet at large. So what the rite that was done was not only a human rite, but it was also a planetary rite. And so the human being and the planet are now on an upwards ascent, for the last 2,000 years or so. 2,022 years we've been on an ascent since the incarnation of Christ, human and planet. And so you have this one aspect you have one impulse that's called the Christ impulse, or the Christ stream, that entered the planet and that entered man through Christ Jesus. and then you have this ability to rise. And so you get this one stream that is an ascension stream. That's going to take thousands and thousands of years until you get to, obviously, the part where your physical form is completely spiritualized, right? But that is following the Christ impulse. That also means that we're evolving with the angelic hierarchies and with the cosmos, because the Christ impulse is the love impulse. It is the impulse of life and perfection in the cosmos itself. Okay, it's a perfect representation of the Father, the solar logos, right? And so we can evolve with that, with the Christ impulse. And so you get this lifting of planet and man into a higher form if you follow it, if you etherize yourself with it, if you catalyze yourself with it through understanding it, through understanding this mystery, and through the practices that allow you to do that. Things like meditation, especially to do with the heart at this point. All of that. And this has been spoken about a lot, actually. It's not just in Anthroposophy. It's been talked about, actually. One of the most interesting that I find is the Hopi. The Hopi had a pretty advanced spiritual system, and they actually called this the two paths. And you can see in some of their artwork that they actually show the earth going off into two. So they show the earth kind of spiritualizing with the Christ impulse up as one of the paths. And then they also show the path of the descension, or the inorganic path of development, which is the second path, which is that materialization arc that just keeps materializing. It does not acknowledge the ritual of Christ. It does not acknowledge the spiritualization arc. It does not understand the Christ impulse, and it just keeps materializing. It is a broken record, stuck, and it just continues materializing, and it's stuck in that materialization impulse, which you could actually call the Antichrist impulse, which is why Ahriman is often associated with the Antichrist nature and is considered an incarnation of the Antichrist nature. And so that impulse just continues materializing. Like, it does not get, there are some groups on the planet that just do not get that we are not in a materialization phase. They think that they don't understand that it's now time to take full responsibility for everything in your life and spiritualize yourself by aligning your mind with God and spiritualize. That is something that's not, they don't understand that. And so that is the second path. And that is also the path of the eighth sphere. Now, in Anthroposophy, this Christ impulse can lead to something that's called New Jupiter, New Jerusalem, and that is the higher planetary sphere. In the New Age, it would probably be called the New Earth. So that exists as well there. So the biggest thing about the spiritualization arc is that we essentially ultimately fall fully into matter. And we become an individual, which is called our I. We get our I, which is a very big deal. And then we have to use our consciousness, use our awareness to basically heal ourselves and work upon ourselves and clear our karma so that we can spiritualize ourselves. And that is really the key to it all, is that in the last arc of our development, we're sort of the real creators. And we can either choose to use the Christ impulse that is within us now, since the crucifixion. We can use that impulse to basically loosen ourselves from the physical form and rise out of matter slowly into the Jupiter phase of development, into the Venus phase of development, and ultimately into Vulcan when our form is completely spiritualized. We can do that, or we can choose to continue in the materialization arc, which is ultimately turns into such an inversion. Because if you're moving in the backwards opposite way, what ends up happening is you just become completely satanic and inverted. If humanity is now in a spiritualization phase, and you continue to be in a materialization phase, and you think that it's all about creating forms, creating robots, creating these external things that you're going to incarnate into, that is not reality. I mean, people can do whatever they want. People have free will, but that is not moving with the impulse of nature, of the sun, of the earth, and of the cosmos and God itself. If people want to create weird cyborg forms or weird technologies and try to upload themselves into this new form they're creating, that is up to them. But let it be known and let it be clear that we are no longer in a materialization phase. We're no longer materializing our form or any form to incarnate into. We are deeply knitted into matter. We now have our form, which is an extension of the angelic hierarchy, and we are now spiritualizing our individual physical form back into matter. So there is no need to create a form with technology, okay? That is not where we are. There's a lot of talk about uploading your brain into, or uploading your consciousness into a different form. This is like a ghost of the earlier phases of development when we literally were creating a form to incarnate into. We were slowly knitting ourselves into our physical form that we were creating as we were going. So this creation of forms is the application of a prior system of magic, a prior developmental consciousness that's no longer relevant to our age. And that is why it's associated with the mark of the beast, the Antichrist, Satanism, is because it's more than just dark. It is the opposite impulse for where we are now. And if you try to make a religion out of the opposite impulse, you will destroy yourself. Because we can live in an illusion if we want to. You can tell yourself all day long that we're in a materialization phase, that we need to create all these forms to upload our consciousness into or incarnate into. You can say that all day long, but that doesn't make it true. The truth is within, and it's something that we have to be humble and surrender to higher forces to figure out, to change that direction in our system. So as we move into the future, you have to know that you will see both of these impulses. You will see the Christ impulse in humanity that seeks to transform the form through love, that seeks ultimate responsibility, that seeks to align our mind and our consciousness with our highest soul aspect, and let that refine us. So eventually we think in an angelic way. We think as God thinks. So we're tuning our consciousness soul with the highest spiritual element possible. And we are removing any belief systems, any ways of being that are not in line with Christ. And that is what spiritualizes our form. But people have a choice to go in a completely different direction if they want to. And when you look at the people following the Christ impulse, you're looking at people actually living harmoniously with nature. You're looking at people living in brotherly and sisterly love. You're looking at people caring about one another. You're looking at the development of empathy. And you're looking at fundamentally a consciousness of an individual that understands that when you rise, I rise. And that there is no society unless we are all spiritually aware. There is no evolution for mankind or planet unless human beings become genuinely spiritually aware, genuinely empathic, and genuinely aligned with their mind with the knowledge of Christ, the knowledge of God that is now within us. And delineating that and understanding what that is, the development of ourself as we work upon ourself. But we will also see another path in humanity that will live side by side with those that are living closer to nature, that are living in more brotherly, sisterly love. We will see a darker path that cannot stop thinking and believing that human beings and the planet evolve through material means, through external means, that the unification of humanity comes through hooking yourself up to a machine to create a hive mind. Okay? No. How humanity is interconnected is through the heart center, completely and utterly naturally. We come from interconnection, we individualize, we re-access that natural interconnection through the heart center. We purify our mind with Christ essence and our heart with Christ essence, with the Christ impulse, in order to just unravel that and re-realize that. So we will see some of the most bizarre and strange techno-spiritual ideas that come forward in the next few decades, because they're trapped in that materialization impulse, and they're still thinking that the human being evolves by projecting itself into forms. Again, Lemuria, even part of Atlantis, was still about creating a form and projecting ourselves into it. That's what it was all about. And remember, the form had to be in alignment and all perfect and all this and that. We're no longer in the phase where we are projecting into forms. We haven't even been remotely in that for probably 20,000 years, for thousands of years, maybe more, genuinely in that phase, probably a lot more. So we can't continue in that impulse where we think we're projecting into forms and that we're materializing when we're in a spiritualization phase. The form is created. We've projected into it. We are materialized. That is not something that the human being decides. That is the human being having materialized itself along with the cosmos, along with the earth, in march, in line with the Christ impulse. We have to follow the Christ impulse. We have to follow the impulse of the Son. We can't go against that. To go against that is destruction. So acting as though we're in this phase where we have to project ourselves into a form, which at this point is this weird mineral form like machines, is incorrect. It's fundamentally incorrect. And it will separate you from your spirit. Because we are not in a materialization phase. We have our form, okay? We have a perfect, beautiful human template. Everybody has it. Doesn't matter whether you think you're perfect or not. You have achieved that template, okay? Now we spiritualize out of it. We spiritualize out of matter now. Has nothing to do with machines, has nothing to do with transhumanism or anything to do with that, okay? No more projecting into forms. We did that, okay? Also, I want to be very clear, and I know that I'm a broken record with this. How we spiritualize and how we materialize is how we spiritualize is the same way that we kind of materialized, which is through our own mind, through our own consciousness. So we spiritualize over a long period of time by purifying our mind and by purifying our heart, life after life. Every time we pass away, every time we pass, we go through the solar system and come back in. And every time we come back in, the form is a different density and the planet is a different density. Now, in the past, when we would pass away and come back in, we were getting denser. Okay. Now, as we pass away and come back in, we're getting lighter. So over time, by us simply taking lives, and by us also aligning our mind with spirit, aligning our mind with Christ, aligning our heart with Christ, living in that way, we dematerialize ourselves. We loosen from our physical body. And over time, we reach the last phase, which is called Atman, or spirit man. And it is associated with planet Vulcan. And we are totally materialized. And that's actually when we can merge into, at that point, not only are we so materialized, we actually can merge in with anything. We're so refined in our essence that we can merge in with a mineral, but not from a place of already being interconnected with that mineral naturally, like in the past. But we actually can merge with a mineral in the mineral kingdom at the Vulcan level as an individual. So in the past, in the earlier materialization arc, we could merge with different things in a spiritual form, but not as an individual. We would lose our individuality. We would kind of just float in and out of things. But now, this is why this is so important, is that now, as we rise, we begin to get finer and finer and finer in our matter, in our essence. It's no longer matter, actually. It's so fine. It's more like an astral form, but that astral form is so purified that it can merge with the mineral kingdom. It can merge with the animal kingdom, with plant kingdoms. It can do all sorts of incredible things, but it maintains its individuality. It doesn't lose itself when it enters these things, which is a really, really big deal. Why I'm explaining this is because there's also going to be a lot of lies that come forward that are, again, part of that materialization arc, which is that human beings evolve through genetic modification, which is basically another form of transhumanism. The belief that humanity was created through hybridization or genetic modification is kind of like a form of transhumanism, in the sense that it's the belief that we evolve through an external modification, that we evolve or we're created through some kind of physical, like messing around of our genetics. When in reality, we were already in existence for so long before our physical form even formed in a way that this could be done. So that's actually a kind of transhumanism in a way, in the sense that it's actually taking the human being and only the physical level, the most material level of the human being, the body, and trying to mess around with DNA in order to get a spiritual result or in order to get a certain result. Okay, this is just, it's clownery. It's actually the degradation of human beings, and you can't actually evolve that. The only way that we can evolve is through inner awareness over a long period of time. And as the earth rises up out of matter, so does the human being, and our form gets lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter over a long period of time. So this idea that, we, in order to evolve, we have to merge our genetics with like alien beings, or some beings, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make it, it's so limiting. It's making these alien beings or these Anunnaki or whoever, it's making them gods, right? And so this is also a weird aspect of the materialization phase, where it's all about trying to project into a form, creating a form, and even at the very end of it, which is what a lot of people see now, the obsession with the modification of the form, and thinking that once we modify our physical form, that we will finally have some kind of spiritual access, that we gain spiritual abilities through modifying our genetics, through adding a machine part, that the physical form needs to be continually worked upon through genetic modification or transhumanism in order to spiritually evolve. And it is completely not reality. Because again, our physical form and our physical template is already perfect. It was perfected thousands of years ago, and it's already peak matter. So the idea that we need like genetic modification to perfect us is bizarre. It's completely materialistic. It doesn't make any sense from an esoteric point of view. And it comes from being obsessed with this materialization impulse that, you know, we can't tell that, oh, we're supposed to spiritualize now. It's, I'm here, I've arrived. I have to work upon myself in an internal way in order to spiritualize myself. Oh, okay. That's where we need to be. And this is also seen in our society in sort of a more mundane way, with individuals just being completely obsessed with their appearance. And this impulse, this obsession with how the physical appearance is, and wanting to modify the physical appearance in order to be more beautiful or handsome or whatever that may be, thinking that it's all about the physical appearance and not understanding that it's the inner world. And so we're missing the boat in society on a mundane level in that sense, but also in the spiritual sense, we're not getting it. We're not understanding that it's about the inner self now, and that the transformations of our inner world through healing and transformation and through Christ essence in our heart, that's actually what makes us spiritualize ourselves into a higher form. So we don't get that through touching the physicality at all. The physicality is complete. You know, we achieved that. So this is very, very, very important to understand. We do not evolve through any kind of physical modifications. And we certainly weren't created through physical modifications either. We're not a hybrid species. Okay, we are fundamentally we fundamentally formed ourselves. That's what the fall is. And so I just want to make sure that this is really crystal clear. Yeah, I want to make sure it's really crystal clear. We're going to be going a lot more into these conversations, into Mars mysteries. It's that Mars impulse, the planetary sphere Mars, that is the materialization impulse. It has a huge materialization effect on us. When we pass away, we move through the planetary spheres, through the sun, and then through eventually Mars. So we go through all the planetary spheres, and then we hit Mars, and then we begin to incarnate on the Earth. And Mars is the planetary sphere that is the materialization, the densification. And it ends up kind of determining whether or not a soul is going to be too materialistically bent or not. And so that's why it's called Mars Mysteries. But in order to go further with Mars Mysteries, where we talk about, you know, transhumanism and, you know, the alien god myth, the Mars origin myth, all this kind of stuff, we really do need to have this understanding of Mars, the Mars impulse, and that materialization arc of humanity. Because again, now that we've gone through the midpoint, the incarnation of Christ, everything was turned inwards, and now we have to spiritualize ourselves out of the material plane. So we're in a totally different arc now. We're in a completely and totally different arc of development. And it requires something different of us than we were participating in earlier times. And so we really have to get that, because it can be very confusing if we don't see the human and planetary evolutionary arc for what it fully is. We can lose our sense in time. It's very easy to lose where we are in our own evolutionary process. We can think that we're in the materialization arc when we're really in the spiritualization arc. And that is what I think will be one of the biggest struggles, esoterically speaking, again, is individuals stuck in the materialization arc, not realizing that we're in a different phase. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. It has been, as always, my absolute pleasure to connect with you. I will be posting, I'll be going live actually this Sunday on my private members platform. I go live every second Sunday, and that's really your time to ask me anything that you want. I go into, personal things, everything from, stuff going on in life to politics, social stuff, and then I go into esoterica. So I'd love to see you there. I'd love to see you as part of the community. And I can also say a lot of things that I can't necessarily say on YouTube. So it's always nice to have that kind of freedom to explore different concepts that you can't necessarily do on this platform. So I'd love to see you there. It also helps me keep this work available and free for everyone. If you like my work as well, you can donate. I have a donate button underneath. If you want to keep these lectures going, that helps me immensely. And I should have a Mars Mysteries episode coming up in the next week as well. And I have another video that's going to get into simulation theory as well. So lots of really good stuff down the pipe. Thank you guys so much for being with me. Don't forget to like, comment, and share, and have yourself a wonderful